Awesome. We'll get started. Hello, everybody. Some of you probably know me, but for those who are new to More Good Jobs, I'm James Shomar, bit of the coordinator, I guess you could say, of our community. And we are a community of entrepreneurial community builders all across the country, actually, and international. We do have some folks from the UK that part of our community. And we're about basically supporting people who are building entrepreneurial communities outside of major startup hubs all over the world and doing that kind of work. So it's a unique type of opportunity we've signed ourselves up for to be doing that kind of work, but really important for a lot of communities to support entrepreneurs and people doing amazing things for our regions and our economy. And this is part of a interview series that we do where we'll ask oh, lost your video for a second there, Dan.
Yep.
We'll edit that. So this is part of an interview series that we'll do. We're inviting different people who play different roles in community building or community builders themselves. And this is a fun one. I've known Dan for quite a few years now, and I'll let him introduce himself. But putting my own opinion on it, what I've really appreciated about Dan's experience in the media and reporting side of things, among others he's involved in, is he shined probably one of the biggest and most important spotlights on developing communities around upstate New York, but primarily Buffalo, and in a way beyond what you typically see in startup circles, beyond the TechCrunch and beyond some of the independent newsletters, getting to the broader business community. And it's always impossible to tell how big of an impact that has on a community, as is any of the work that we're doing. But it's suffice to say the correlation is strong. So I'm going to let Dan introduce himself here, and we'll get rolling. So thanks again, Dan, for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks for having me, James. And yeah, good to talk to you again. It's been quite a journey. We're like the graybeards now. We were the young guys not that long ago, feels like. Now we're talking about our legacies. Yeah, listen, again, Dan Miner. Currently, I work for the University of Buffalo. I run their Startup New York program, which is a tax incentive tool for startups and small businesses. Startup New York has a varied track record of success depending on where in the state you are. You probably have a different impression of it, but it's a big part of the economic development infrastructure in Buffalo and supports hundreds of companies here. Before that, as James noted, I was a business journalist for 10 years for Buffalo Business First. And I covered a lot of different industries and sectors, but I'm probably most well known for and spent the most of my time on covering Buffalo's emerging innovation economy. And that was really interesting because I got to kind of get in the door there at a time when it was a really small project. A small initiative, and today it feels more durable. But it's easy to forget the days when it felt like the wrong economic headwind, or if a single company going out of business could really sort of endanger the entire boat. And that really was what it felt like back then. Was there was just a room of one room of people, and everybody knew each other's names. So I like to think of those days because on a day-to-day level in a city like Buffalo, which still has a long ways to go in building a durable entrepreneurial economy, it's really important to benchmark against your own history, not just constantly be looking at other municipalities or regions that are have their own stories, and maybe look in terms of the data or in terms of the anecdotes in the companies to be more successful. When you're starting from scratch, I think that the most important thing is to look back at your how you've grown, to take a step back. And when you step out of the day-to-day and you look at Buffalo now as compared to 10 years ago, it's been an absolute sea change, and it makes you look forward to the next 10 years.
So bring us back even before you got to Buffalo Business First, like who are you?
Yeah.
How you got there?
Yeah, I went to high school in Chautauqua County in near Jamestown in a little village called Lakewood. I played junior hockey at Niagara County. I went to Niagara County Community College while I was playing junior hockey for a couple of years, and then matriculated to Geneseo. So at Geneseo, I was English student, lit student, but I was how would I describe myself? A mediocre at best college student. I really did like reading and writing, but I was kind of one of those people with maybe the wrong set of priorities back in those days. So I know that this is being blasted out to a set of really high performance, high aptitude, successful individuals. So I just want to tell everybody who's listening that it actually is possible to go through 5 years of undergraduate and graduate and have zero idea as you're driving away from the college what the hell you're going to do next. That is a thing that somehow is possible to accomplish. So that was me. So with a lit degree and kind of mediocre grades and really no interest in doing anything that people use to leverage their literature or English degrees, such as teaching English or going to law school, anything that would involve more school, I was out. So as I took a look around at my sort of very non-technical skill set at the time, journalism was something that appealed to me because you do get to read and write, but also that it was practical. It's experiential, and so it felt like something that had a big part of the sort of, obviously a major part of the civic conversation, no matter where you are. Journalism is a big part of that, and something that just kind of like sounded like fun, and there was a challenge for some of the things that don't come naturally to me. I'm not naturally confrontational, for instance. I'm not naturally social or especially confident in those kinds of settings. And so this was an opportunity to confront those things head on. So I got internships in just north of San Francisco. I had an internship in Manhattan. I interned at the Erie Times News for any of our Western Pennsylvania viewers. And finally convinced some poor editor in the city of Tonawanda, which is a suburb of Buffalo, to hire me for a city position. So I kind of rung by rung climbed the ladder after that, covering mostly municipal beats and school boards and going to planning boards at the Tonawanda News, which, rest in peace, is now defunct. The Niagara Gazette after that, and then finally to James's wife's native hometown, to the Utica Observer-Dispatch. So I spent about 4 years in Utica covering the sort of bare knuckle politics and of City Hall, and about that time, my wife and I were entering our 30s. We were looking to start a family. We're from Western New York, and as we later learned, this was a very prescient decision. Grandparents save lives. So we decided to, as we were looking to start a family, to move closer to them, and so to do so, in looking to continue my journalism career in a new place, I pestered the people who ran Business First at the time until they relented and gave me a staff writing position there. I don't want to just like constantly talk. Overrun the conversation here, but I will. I just want to mention the context for me moving into Buffalo at the time, which will lead into the talk about deciding to cover entrepreneurs and startups, was that basically for 6 years about what I did was I covered the nodes of small town Rust Belt decline. That's what it means to be a municipal reporter in small cities from Buffalo to Albany. And that's really valuable. You need to be realistic about what you're writing about, and because if you're not, then people won't have the information to confront the challenges of the place. But it started to feel kind of rote. The demographics, the direction of the municipal health of these places, and the just sort of overall condition of their economies were really kind of like a story that had already been told. And honestly, even though these regions had changed a lot over the, obviously everywhere changes all the time, but over the past 50 years or so, the economic context really hadn't. The arrow was pointed more or less down for decade after decade, and it kind of felt like, you could write interesting stories and stuff like that, but it didn't feel like I had a lot to contribute to the broader conversation about the evolution of these places. And so as I moved back to Buffalo, more or less my hometown, I was really looking for a way to describe how people are living in these places in a different way.
So when you first started, by the way, thank you for that background. That's awesome. I mean, much of this work comes down, it's how we often describe it, comes down to stories and personal stories. And so I'm really appreciate that you don't shy away from your personal story, because that's so critical and quite interesting, I have to say too. So you, back in Buffalo, arrived Buffalo business first. You start kind of covering the Rust Belt, as it were, just sort of declining.
Education and manufacturing were my initial beats.
Okay, I was going to ask, yeah, your initial. All right, so those are your initial beats. Then, tell us about. Was it your own initiative to start looking at startups? Was there something coming through the office? Like, how did that formulate?
Oh yeah, it was my own initiative. I mean, it took years. I guess by the time I left Business First last year, people were talking about the work that I had done and about the Buffalo startup scene as if it were this like bedrock part of the economy and a major part of the conversation and something everybody was involved in, and from, something that you couldn't afford to ignore. But in 2012, and for many years after that, that was like a thing I did on the side after I got all my other work done, was covering entrepreneurs and startups. But to set the stage, I was really looking for a way to kind of make my mark and not to just write individual and systemic stories about the manufacturing scene in Buffalo. And so I ended up at an event called Buffalo Startup Weekend, which some people may be familiar with the sort of startup weekend idea. But basically, 100 people or so or more get in a room, and they divide up into teams and they build pre-seed startups over the course of the weekend. And there may be some sponsorship and some catering and like minimal prize money, but really it's just the exercise itself of like building a company from scratch and just getting that like light speed view of what it takes to go from like ideation to prototype. And at the time, I just remember being in a room of people, young professionals in Buffalo, who had a different definition of what opportunity meant. I mean, in Buffalo, which, I don't mean to be, it still is Western New York is a large economy, and lots of people, despite the economic decline over the past 50 years that I mentioned, have had very successful careers. But the way that it was understood that you did that was that you went into either corporate life or you went into professional services. And it was the attorneys and the corporate executives who ran this town and made the decisions and sat on the boards and made up the heft of what the business leadership kind of looked or felt like. And so these were people who were sort of like unconvinced of the idea that was the only pathway. And what they really were convinced of was in their own aptitude, their own ability to turn their talent into companies that could define their legacies. And what I saw was basically I saw the very early beginnings of a grassroots movement. This was before the state lavished its attention on Buffalo, before major philanthropies got involved, which they are now, before this sort of civic, political, private sector machine here started to take startups seriously. It was just this group of like ragtag kids in flannels at Madai college, just like sketching out business ideas. And some of those people are now very, very successful company founders and, millionaires many times over. But at the time, huh?
Your mind? Any names? Sorry to interrupt you, but I'm
Sure,
just...
the easy one that comes to mind is that Dan Maniszewski was there, and he was an organizer of it. Dan Maniszewski was the technical co-founder of ACV Auctions, which went on to become the first unicorn, software unicorn in Buffalo, and IPO'd in 2020. Yeah, lots of it was ACV Auctions was a great story in of itself because it was very much like of Buffalo. It was angel funded here. It won the 43 North Business Competition. It really is that the majority of its employees are here, and its employees all had stock options, and its stock kind of has been under a roller coaster, but it's actually doing quite well lately. It's up to I think $16 or $17. So I still check it. Some habits die hard. But anyway, so some guys like that, and I'll have to try and follow up with some others, but I'm sure there were some. So anyway, so I just kind of started following them around, and I guess one of the important things I would talk about in terms of how this relates to my journalistic approach to covering them was that I never was really interested in tech as a beat. And I never was really fascinated by tech products or tech SaaS companies in terms of their business models. I mean, I learned a lot about them over the years, but I wasn't covering usually at a business newspaper or anywhere else, you divvy it up. You get the manufacturing guy, the commercial real estate guy, the hospitals guy, but I never really thought of myself as like the tech guy. It was really like this was a side gig following around this group of people who had the gall to think that like you don't have to work at M&T or at a law firm to build to get rich and to do really interesting, impactful things in the community. And yeah, so that's where it started.
Wow, cool. So you really started even before 43 North, before some of those well-known parts of the ecosystem started to develop. So tell us through that story how I guess this sort of side job that you started began to take a life of its own, and how that grew from there.
I mean, I think that I figured we would get to that, and I started this way. One of the reasons I started was because I think that everything that's happened since 2012 in Buffalo has been the inside the nuclear core of all the things all the services that have been created to support startups is that grassroots scene. These things were like this was the change agent that everything else has been bolted onto. And I think that that's important is that you start with this sort of like self-generating engine of interest and ambition. If you're going to kind of like start from scratch and building an entrepreneurial ecosystem. If you just build services, then you don't, it's kind of like they're like sort of directionless. And it really is the people at the end of the day who drive the success of these places. So anyway, so people took notice ultimately. I mean, I think that maybe I had a little bit to do with that, although certainly not the person who would take full credit for it. But that like there were incubators in Buffalo, technology incubators in Buffalo that were staffed with people who were building high growth tech companies that were looking to be like market leading companies. And now it's like, of course, those are everywhere. And especially in like any city that has 100,000 people or more, they all have seen tech startups over the past decade. But at the time, it was like, I mean, it was a legitimate story to just go, hey, look, I found a tech company in Buffalo. That was like a novelty. People would like read that headline, like this exists was like a unique insight. So the cool thing that happened was that people that more one by one, different sectors of the community started leaning into that idea. And so you had people from those corporate entities or from those professional services worlds. You started to see lawyers, walking through the events. You started to see accountants with satellite offices in the local like startup innovation center place that was like the local like hub for activity back in those days. And there was this sort of like incremental momentum that that ultimately garnered the attention of the people who did hold the power, the political and sort of civic power around here. And if you remember, for those of us who are old enough to remember, the governor at the time, Governor Cuomo, was looking to kind of like build new economic community building paradigms in the regions across the state. He established these councils, these regional economic development councils, to feed ideas from the community up instead of having the state make top-down decisions. I'm not trying to be overly like some of the Cuomo era economic development policies and projects in Buffalo have been utter disasters. So I'm not like blind to that. Those are legitimate criticisms. But some of the in terms of the idea of taking the people who were involved in the community and taking ideas from them and building kind of like Keystone State projects out of it. That's how those ideas came from the observations of what was going on, this fledgling momentum up through the state mechanisms and ended up creating entities like 43 North. So that's the founding story of 43 North. It came through the Regional Economic Development Council and got funded through the Buffalo Billion Economic Development, whatever you would call it, pledge, and then came back to Buffalo, and they established a nonprofit, and they built it here with the support of a regional board. So in 43 North is I don't know. You said that you have people who I'm not just talking to like an upstate Western New York viewership here. Is a annual state-funded business competition in Buffalo, which awards $5 million in prize money for companies that are either here or that are moving here to catalyze, the growth, basically to seed more seed and Series A startups in Buffalo. And it's so it's been doing that for years now. The 43 North portfolio is like 60 companies strong. But we could talk about the performance of the portfolio and the effectiveness of the competition in terms of building companies, and if you want. But one of the points I would want to make is that it really served as a bullhorn for the Buffalo startup economy, and the marketing power for 43 North has been one of the primary benefits because they have this annual highly attended party / shark style business competition, and they also fan out throughout the country in trying to build their pipeline of applicants for their program and establish relationships with people in different places, funders and whatnot, and that's trickled out into like a whole bunch of news articles over the years, which have been mostly fawning about the idea that this legacy Rust Belt city is like turning the page and creating a new platform for its economy to grow into the 22nd century.
Now, not to dominate with a personal story, but I don't know if you remember, that was the first place that I remember meeting you. Was my first startup was along with Chuck Storman's startup, actually at the time, were the two semifinalists for the first 43 North competition from Central New York. And that was the first time I spoke with you, as you were interviewing all the semifinalists.
Yeah.
My first conversation. I mean, obviously we ultimately lost, funny enough, to ACV Auctions, which they just totally deserved to win, as it turns out. But I remember that that was our, I don't know if you remember that, but that was our first conversation.
I do remember that because 43 North brings, to enhance the tension of the final event, they bring people in who, you were a semifinalist. So were you in the last 15 or were you in the last 20?
I forget what they narrowed that down to at that point. I didn't make it to Chuck made it to the finals. I think he was a runner up or something. But
really?
And Chuck ironically was an advisor to my company. Just shows you how small the community was across upstate at that time.
Yeah, definitely, definitely.
Yeah, and then, but I was curious, backing up a second to when, I mean, it was literally like this, I'm thinking this like ragtag group of misfits with Dan pulling them all together, which again, so glad that he's had the success he has given his efforts in community building at the very early days. But when you showed up to this meetup, like, did they kind of look at you cockeyed, like, why are you here? Like,
Yeah.
I'm curious of the reception at that time.
Yeah, I didn't feel particularly like at home in that group for quite some time. Years. And of course, as a journalist, you don't need to feel at home. It's your prerogative to go chase the story, first and foremost. So I'm not sure they all liked me, honestly. But again, that's an ancillary concern when you're writing stories about them. And I was ill-equipped to be a business reporter generally, and particularly not ready to describe the trajectory of startup companies. I remember it was it took me like several years before somebody was like, this is what a tranche is. Like, just the basic basic nomenclature took forever. So now, I think some of these things are maybe a little bit more well understood, whereas this is like the era of the Facebook movie. And people were really just starting to awaken to despite the 90s and the aughts, still like getting used to the idea that it's not just, Valley-based companies that do this. You're going to start seeing companies filter through, lots of different places. So I don't know, I'm off on a tangent here, but so I didn't feel especially well supported at the paper, because they were like, why are you writing about this? This isn't what we do. Business First provides business to business intelligence. Really, it's really there to create nuggets of information that other business people can take to business meetings, sales pitches, marketing events. Like, you're not really focused on like the public perception of the story. You're like, how useful is this to the next guy that's looking to do business? And what they assumed was that these kinds of people only wanted to read about commercial real estate and restaurants and how the local hospital system was doing, or like what M&T stock looked like that day. And I think that I didn't really know this. I was just doing this kind of like on my own time as a project, but I think what happened was that the insight that I had, which is, who are the people who are looking to, what is the rising generation of business professionals? How do they define business? And how are they taking those theories and those philosophies and those philosophies and operationalizing them? And so I think what it was my early journalism on this was a window into how the world was changing, and what people wanted out of their lives and out of their jobs. And these individual stories were kind of like anecdotes. And I think that what happened was that it wasn't that you could be in banking, you could, or you could be in a corporate office, and that was valuable to you. Whereas, because you're literally learning, like, how your own community is changing as it's changing. And you can now go to the meetup and say or the next, like whatever corporate backslapping event, and act like and so giving people the thing that I sort of stumbled upon, I certainly didn't mean to do this, was that it gave people insight into how their own world was evolving. And that was the value of it. But like, it took a while. So the startup community was looking at me cockeyed, like, what are you doing here? Like, way overly not promoting, but giving a much bigger lens to how they felt like their humility was pulling them back from, check this guy out, check out this company. And also this guy that had no idea how to actually describe, so I'm like learning on the fly and like screwing up the conflating different kinds of funding and whatnot, and learning about all this. And in the paper, they were like, yeah, I guess you can keep doing this as long as, the other things that we actually pay you to do
Also,
keeping that. Hey, is my now boss, the UB's vice president of economic development, Rick Gardner, likes to say, you have to keep the hay on the wagon. So as long as I was keeping the hay on the wagon with the other things, I could go, pursue my own things. And through 43 North and through the like sort of one by one different and efforts being formalized around the startup economy in Western New York, that changed. And you had some companies that started to kind of lift off, and certainly when ACV, let's say 5 years later, it was starting to raise beyond the borders of Buffalo and starting to raise from the Tribecas and the Fred Wilsons and ultimately from the Bessemers of the world, that people looked back at this and said, oh yeah, you can build market leading companies in Buffalo. And the future of this economy depends on the regional economy depends on it, because these are companies that import economic activity. They're not just symptoms of economic activity, which is really what Buffalo's, and like a lot of other, you could say the same for Rochester and Syracuse and Utica and Albany. Well, maybe not Albany, it's kind of being the capital is a little bit of a weird one, but that like a lot of what we have here we're resting on having a large government presence, having a huge educational presence, professional services, healthcare, like the legacy manufacturing and some of the corporations that stuck around. And that is basic. Those are a lot of those things are like symptoms of one another. They're not new things that can bring new kind of like GDP into the region. And so I came to think of this, and I think a lot of other people came to the conclusion that this is not just something that's interesting that's happening, and it's not just like a social or a cultural trend. It's entirely necessary to ensure the future of this economy. And that's when I think it really became a thing that everybody was doing. And now everybody's doing this in Buffalo. This isn't a secret anymore, and it's not a trifle. It's a economic force here, and something that I think most people here recognize has to succeed.
how did the readership, I guess, of your reporting change over time? I've never actually asked you that point blank before.
So all news organizations are obsessive about their metrics now. So starting around the time I got there, one of the primary ways as a reporter you're measured is by the amount of visitors and the amount of page views that you bring in, and ultimately is paid journalism sites start to gate their content, how many people subscribe against the stories you write. And yeah, it was interesting because there's a lot of different kinds of stories you can write within the context of startup journalism. And I think over the years, I always found it valuable as a starting point for companies, but simply it became less novel that there just was a startup, like introducing this company that is got a new B2B SaaS play that's going to change this marketplace. And those would whereas those were like, what the hell in Buffalo? Those would like blow up in like 2012 to 2014. Those ultimately kind of became like, because I wrote hundreds of those stories, I think people's eyes started to sort of, get a little tired from those. I never stopped doing them because that started the relationship. And for me, it was a down payment on the stories I would have in the future, because then I would have a relationship with them and I would say to them directly, when you raise, I want to know. And I'm going to be pestering you about it anyway, so you might as well tell me, because you're not going to like get away from me. And people really responded to the idea of capital raises, and those were the ones that ultimately were the most consistently valuable from a metrics perspective, because a lot of business journalism is about money, the flow of money. And it's not just like the idea of like, oh, this cash is being wired and look, it's so interesting that this company has it. It's really like, it's a validation point in journalism terms for what this company like sort of represents. Like, okay, so who backed you? Was it the local angels who've done well in their startups? Was it your friends and family? Was it did you actually attract like some sorts of institutional capital? Like the who and the why. And then, if you raise money, it also says that you're about to have an economic impact in Buffalo. And one of the things I would hear from my from founders after they raised was that they would kind of be in they had to be in a posture for people reaching out to them, because the real estate community would take notice. If a company raises, maybe a company needs an office. So they'd get flooded with inbound calls from the local real estate community. Accountants would, there's not that many accountants in Buffalo who are really well equipped to handle the startup life cycle, especially as companies start to grow and they need like to bolt on services beyond just like your tax returns.
Yeah.
So those were really interesting. And then the other thing that happened was, I don't know whether I was just kind of, I didn't create this, I guess is what I would say, but I took advantage of it, was that people here started to become like names. So the people in that room, in that initial room, their careers became interesting to other people. So, another person in that room was like a Clark Dever, and I wrote about him in and out of companies many years, and those were always well read. What's Clark doing now? What Dan Maniszewski is doing now? Who's Dan investing in? Writing about his financial package from the ACV success, writing about his exit from the company, and like the whole full circle, what it means. And so I guess you created these kind of like civic, like low, I don't know, I want to say low level, but like these kind of like celebrities that come out of the regional startup ecosystem. And I think that's kind of true almost anywhere, is that if you go into a startup company and you're sort of well known for having success, and it's based not in like New York City or Boston or like somewhere where there's just too much activity for anybody to be renowned for one just because they became a multimillionaire. In Buffalo, that means you've got cachet. And if you've got cachet, then I was interested in writing about you. So the stories of people whose careers were evolving, and as people watched them become more and more successful, were really interesting to people. And I think that's one thing that definitely gets undersold in other forms of like local startup journalism, like the kind that I was doing, was people want to read about other people, in the same way that it's like a minor leagues version of why Elon Musk's name is in like every headline. It's because it's all about like metrics and data and reader interest. And you've got those in Syracuse. You've got some guys in Syracuse. You've got some guys and girls in Rochester who've done big things. And like, to me, literally every decision they make is interesting. And I think that gets undersold. People don't really recognize that as much as they should.
The one thing I find interesting, that what you said too, and thinking about the story as it compares to my knowledge, at least across upstate, and again, not to be, hopefully, viewers can kind of translate what's happening in upstate here to your own scenarios. That's the goal here. But, what I find interesting there is that so many of those early founders and those people who I would say, regardless of how their career trajectory, were definitely influential in the creation of the Buffalo community and establishment of that, sort of self-organized in that way, like created that meetup. And people around, at least in Syracuse, thinking Rochester, kind of know each other. The only scenario I can think of having heard something similar to that is in Troy, New York. There's a little bit of that with the gaming community, but I'm just curious from your perspective, how impactful that was in the growth of the community, as opposed to all of them doing things at the same time, but somewhat independently, maybe knowing about each other. The fact that they were, I don't know, maybe a friend group, you could even call it that. What's your perspective on that?
Yeah. I think that yeah. So you use the word community obviously can be used differently depending on the context of the conversation. And what you're describing is that these different startup economies have different characteristics. They're communities. And in Buffalo, it is indeed very integrated. That has those there's like I don't know what the mathematical term is here, going back to my mediocrity as a student in college, but like there two people working together are worth more than just the sum of their efforts. And so the community has it's kind of leveraged itself. And part of it is because it started that way. Like I said, that grassroots energy that I was talking about has never died. It's waned, but it's never died. And some of these people, the people in that room, are not necessarily all best friends now, and they're not necessarily all involved in that. But there have been at various times new people who have taken up the torch and created that sense of momentum. And I've always thought that was the beating heart of what's going on in Buffalo. That's what makes all the other things successful. So I don't know if that really answers your question, but there's definitely still a group of people who are really engaged in like getting involved on the community side, and not just on leveraging each other's business opportunities. So not well answered there. I'm sorry, but
no, it was actually, because what you're describing is a sustainable community, because new people are continuing to pick up the torch, because people are going to shift in their role and where they are, and frankly new generations are going to come in ideally. So
there's this I'm on a low level volunteer for this event called Buffalo Startup Week that was held last year in Buffalo. And by the way, people should on this call should definitely show up. It's going to be cool. And it's going to be held again. I think it's in this October. But the moral of the story I'm telling right now is that the people who are involved in that are people who came into this way after me, but they've got so much energy and aptitude for it. And like, it's really cool to see, because that's what people were worried about, was that sense of community would eventually go away, or that it would dissipate. But it's got a certain magic or a certain life to it. It's not magic. It's people. People have the will to in Buffalo to keep creating it, and there have been some people who've sort of been there all along to continue to make sure that it gets pushed forward. And I think that's another one of the things is there's been a lot of intentionality around making sure that it's not just the things at the 43 North Incubator, which is the only place where you can go to see this activity, but that people can go and have different entry points into different groups of entrepreneurial startup enthusiasts. And that Buffalo Startup Week is just an anecdote or an example of how that definitely lives out in Buffalo. And that's one of the things that makes me really bullish on the fact that we can continue on the upward curve that we've been on.
So I want to take the remaining time to go back, much more specifically to the journalism aspect of this, because that's one thing I found really unique again here. And what I would think is a sign of the success you had is I've noticed other media outlets have started to have specific beat reporters on on this topic since. And so I don't know how you can interpret that other than as a signal of success of it. But I'm just curious, it's impossible to really fully decouple activity and impact in the community. I get that. But so a lot of times we pull out these anecdotes of Signal to where we go, well, I know that must have had some kind of impact. I don't know what, and I can't create causality, but like the impact would be clear. I'm curious from your perspective in reporting. I know you're modest, but I'm going to ask you to talk about that. And the reason I'm going to ask you to talk about that, I'm giving this kind of preamble, is because again, in my experience, your reporting in this was very unique in a very positive way. To the extent that, like, even a few years ago, I remember there was an exit in Syracuse and you covered it before the local people heard it. And I was like, I sent it to some friends I know. I'm like, come on, like, what are you doing? You know, so I can't imagine that didn't have impact just in terms of creating more visibility. I'm curious from your perspective, you have some anecdotes or something you'd want to share about how that can be impactful for a community as like a almost like a civic role to be involved in just simply covering that. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, I mean, I think that, you know, journalism is the most effective way at creating the connective tissue of the community. And unfortunately, journalism is a very troubled industry. And right now, I think what serves the best role, and I'm most familiar with Western New York and you know, start of New York or Central New York, but is these like people's like stakeholders in their newsletters. Like that's where outside of journalism now, that's where I get most of my like region-wide coverage is the various people who are kind of promoting their networks opportunities, and that's cool. But you know, it kind of speaks to the fact that if that's the primary source, then there's definitely you know, more to be done to put some more meat on the bone of what's actually going on the ground in those communities. But I mean, listen. So again, business first, I always define my role as business intelligence. I didn't write a single story that I didn't think another business person could use. So it wasn't a daily newspaper where you're performing some like, you know, there was a lot of like public facing, you know, benefit to the stories I wrote, I think, but like that wasn't the core value of that product. But I think ultimately publicizing the innovative projects that people are in a specific region or locality, what that does is that creates opportunity signals for other people in the community. And I think that, you know, for me, that's one of the reasons why I thought the funnel was so broad for what's interesting, was because, you know, I think that almost anybody who's in business can use the story of a talented person starting a high growth startup in that ecosystem. And so I do think that I was right. I think that theory proved itself out because people used the way that I was publicizing the activity to as a catalyst to get involved. Because what they did was, it wasn't like they were like startup hobbyists or that they were even especially well-intentioned. They may have been, but that was besides the point. What they saw was opportunity. And with startup business journalism, I think what you're doing is you're creating that, you know, you're creating that threshold for people so that I mean, people are all the time who are in business are looking for ways to maximize their own careers and get interested in things that can make them better, more successful, more wealthy. And I think what people recognize in a regional startup economy is that this is a potentially really useful thing to know and to get involved in. The other thing is that, you know, I did write some investigative stories over the years and some enterprise feature stories and some stories with a less positive, you know, bent to them. But ultimately, I wasn't an especially aggressive, I wasn't like a watchdog reporter. However, I do think that the simple act of being there and the simple act of writing what people do in a sort of dispassionate way, you know, so that it's not marketing, so that you don't only hear about the raises, but you hear about the company failures, you hear about the companies idling, you hear about the group that tried to raise a fund that didn't. And having the idea that all of that can be publicized creates a natural check and a natural balance that is really like people may not like it when it's happening, but it's really useful from a community building perspective. The idea that okay, we want to do this, but what if Dan finds out? You know, that what if, it funnels people into better, and this is a general journalistic principle, it funnels people into better decision making, you know, because now you're thinking about, you have a different perspective on your own decisions when you think that somebody else is paying attention. And I think that really I think they made a big difference over the years in the policy making side of, you know, because now we've got, it's not just 43 North, it's, you know, Launch New York, which I know is very active in central New York. We've got the Western New York Impact Investment Fund. I work on a newly created team at UB called the Startup Ventures team, which has created all these new community facing resources. And UB does equity investments now. And we've got an Endeavor chapter in Buffalo. There are distinct angel groups. There are distinct grassroots groups. And, you know, at one time or another, all of those entities were in the formation stage or in the strategy stage, and they had to think about me. When they were thinking about building these things, they had to think about what you know, and not me, but like, you know, they had to think about the journalist who was going to be there and who was going to be, you know, translating their story or recalibrating their story in the way that, you know, I think was the most truthful, not from the marketing perspective, but from trying to be objective about it. And like, that's what I think. Honestly, I do believe in the previous point I made about the connectivity and the opportunities that you're creating and making people feel good about themselves as they, you know, start these very difficult thing, which is to be a startup entrepreneur. But I think honestly, that primary thing, one of the primary things is this natural check where you're there, kind of for better or for worse. So yeah. And then the last real quick point I'll make is that because there really aren't a ton of really effective local startup reporters that outside of the major startup hubs, when you have one, I think it does serve as a bullhorn. So it's not like I was doing anything that was promotional in nature, but I do think that it did promote the region ultimately, because, you know, a lot of companies got visibility to investors, to potential employees. They got outside validation from local stories simply because it was unique to have those stories being told about them.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Dan. This has been awesome. I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate the impact and having committed, about 10 years of your life to doing that. You know, I think there's no doubt the impact that it had, regardless of how we could ever quantify it. For sure, it's definitely been observed even by outsiders like myself. And you know, I hope it can. Part of why I was hoping you would do this was that it could set an example that maybe someone in some other ecosystem finds this, you know, comes across this and either decides to take action in that, or recognizes it as a new thing that they could incorporate into their community building, or hopefully, you know, inspire somebody else to take up that torch in their community, because of that impact, and it's a unique role. Not often talked enough about. When people think about ecosystems, the media often gets left out of that discussion, despite the impact that can have. And so I thought that was important to highlight, and you were a great exemplar of that, and I appreciate it. So thank you.
Oh, thank you. This is really kind words, and I really appreciate it. And this was lots of fun. So I appreciate the chance to talk about these things, because it really is really neat just to revisit all of that work and that whole journey. By the way, if anybody does take an interest in this and they want to talk to me more about it, they're free to reach out to me. I'm happy to talk to anybody at any time. So it's DAMINER minor at buffalo.edu.
Oh, that's awesome. Thank you for sharing that, and I can incorporate that when we blast it out. Yes, it's great. We'll share it on our Twitter page, the More Good Jobs Twitter page, our YouTube channel, our newsletter, and so forth. And there'll be more to come. Stay tuned. Thanks, Dan. We'll talk again soon.
Thank you.
Take care, brother.